While discussions continue over the possible nomination of Senator Hillary Clinton as the next Secretary of State, President-elect Obama's transition team announced Wednesday that Tom Daschle, the former Senate Democratic leader, will be named Secretary of Health and Human Services. As speculation abounds over who President-elect Obama will name to key cabinet positions, we look at some of the central figures advising Obama, many of whom are leading candidates for posts in the next administration. The website Politico reported last week that 31 out of 47 people named so far to transition or staff posts have ties to the Clinton administration. Today, we host a discussion on what this means for Obama's mandate for change.
Jeremy Scahill is the award-winning investigative journalist, Democracy Now! Correspondent, and author of the international bestseller Blackwater, The Rise of the World's Most Powerful Mercenary Army. He's just written a piece that's been published on alternet.org. It's called This Is Change, 20 Hawks, Clintonites and Neocons to Watch For in Obama's White House. He joins us here in our Firehouse studio, and we're joined by telephone by David Corn, the Washington bureau chief of Mother Jones. He's just written a piece on Mother Jones' blog called The Agents of Change on Obama's Transition Team. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! David Corn, let's begin with you. Who are these agents of change?
Well, I looked at the people who have been announced so far, who are making up the transition team, those who are conducting the reviews at the agencies. There are about 130 of them. And I've noted that a lot of them are exactly the type of people you think they'd be. The type of corporate lawyers in Washington who bounce between government jobs and private sector jobs. And, you know, some who worked at Fannie Mae, some who worked at corporate law firms, and then they worked at the Senate and then go back and forth. A lot of them used to work in the Clinton administration. But in addition to those sorts of people on the transition team, I noted there were a bunch of people who've been progressive public policy advocates, academics and other experts who spent their whole adult careers devoted to policy making, not necessarily to going between government and private sector and making a bunch of money. You know, one example is a fellow named Tom Perez, who's now the head of the Maryland Department of Labor. But while he was a federal prosecutor during the Clinton years, he's also been a consumer advocate for decades and has worked on a lot of civil rights issues and hate crime issues. Theodore Shaw is the president of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund and has worked on capital punishment cases and school desegregation cases, affirmative action cases. And then there's, you know, just in terms of looking at how this bunch may be different than the Bush bunch, which isn't hard to do, Sarah Sewell is leading the transition's national security team. She works at the Core Center, which for Human Rights Policy at the John F. Kennedy School of Government. And one of her specialties is the ethics of fighting terrorism. Just think about that for a moment. The ethics of fighting terrorism, that's probably nothing that got a lot of attention in say, Dick Cheney's office. So, again, she is an academic who has worked on and off Capitol Hill, but really has devoted her life to working on policy issues. So while, you know, we can argue and scream, and I'm not a fan of the possible Hillary Clinton appointment to the State Department, you know, the transition team does include people who are genuine policy advocates who, if they get a chance to have any authority, could indeed be agents of change.
David, you also mentioned Pamela Gilbert and Cruz Reynoso also on that. Could you talk about who they are as well?
Sure. And I should say that Pam Gilbert is an old friend of mine. For years, she was the consumer product director at the U.S. Public Interest Research Group, really one of the best consumer advocacy groups in Washington, and then she ran Public Citizens Congress Watch for a number of years, which, you know, again, one of the most progressive public interest-oriented organizations on Capitol Hill, really trying to hold Congress's feet to the fire. Cruz Reynoso is kind of a real hero. He was the first Chicano appointed to serve on the California Supreme Court, late 70s, early 80s, I don't remember exactly when, but he consistently voted against the death penalty while on the court, overturning death penalty sentences. And largely because of that, he became a conservative target. And in 1986, the conservatives mounted a campaign against him, and in California, you can vote judges out of office. And he was indeed, with two other members of the California Supreme Court, voted out off the bench in 1986. But a few years ago, when President Clinton was in office, he received the Presidential Medal of freedom, which is, I think, the highest civilian award you can get. So he's a pioneer and a fellow who has been very courageous in sticking to his principles, and it cost him his job. So there are a lot of people who, I'm not saying a lot, there are people on the review team, the transition team, who have been motivated by high-minded principles for most of their working careers. That's not everybody, and we can find plenty of others that raise questions, but it's good to know that at least there's some balance here.
Jeremy Scahill, you've written this piece on alternate.org that just got published. This has changed. 20 hawks, Clintonites, and Neocons to watch for in Obama's White House. Right.
I mean, David is talking about the transitional team that Obama's pulled together that's working now under John Podesta, Bill Clinton's former chief of staff. And what I've looked at in depth is the foreign policy team that surrounds Barack Obama. These are people that are on the transition team or are foreign policy advisors or already have been named to the cabinet or very well may get cabinet positions. One of the things I think is important to point out here, people have made the point that the Obama house is flush with Clintonites. You know, all of these people that we knew in the 1990s, some people who were senior advisors to Hillary Clinton jumped onto the Obama bandwagon after Hillary conceded defeat. But what's important to remember is what 1990s foreign policy looked like, because while Barack Obama campaigned on a pledge to bring change, if you actually analyze U.S. foreign policy from George H.W. Bush through Bill Clinton to George W. Bush, there are great consistencies. I mean, Bill Clinton's policies, his foreign policies in the 1990s, really laid the groundwork for much of what President Bush did when he was in office. You had the Iraq Liberation Act, which was passed in 1998, which was the result of a collusion between neoliberal Democrats, neoconservative Republicans. That made regime change in Iraq mandatory. Clinton mercilessly punished the people of Iraq through economic sanctions, the longest sustained bombing campaign since Vietnam. They dismantled Yugoslavia, bombed it. They implemented policies such as the Rambouillet Accord against Milosevic that was essentially a setup to take away Yugoslavia's sovereignty, very similar to what Bush did in the lead up to the Iraq invasion. Clinton hit Sudan, he hit Afghanistan. His free trade globalization policies devastated economies around the world and working people. And what I point out in my piece is that many of the architects of those policies in the 1990s were not only people who supported the Iraq war in the lead up and promoted the myth that Saddam had weapons of mass destruction, but they are now at the center of the Obama foreign policy team. I mean, from the jump, you had Joe Biden. His selection as the vice presidential candidate was a clear indication that the old guard Democrats were going to be securely embedded in the Obama White House. You know, Biden, as I think one of the experiences in Biden's life bears particular mention, and that is that Biden was the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in the summer of 2002 when the Iraq war was being debated. Joe Biden was the man in charge of framing the so-called debate, and he refused to call two witnesses in particular who would have thoroughly debunked all of the lies that were being told. One is the former chief UN weapons inspector, Scott Ritter. The other is the former head of the UN program in Iraq, Hans von Spanik. Now, I was with von Spanik at that time, and we were pressing Biden's committee to call him to testify. The reason we wanted von Spanik there is because he had just come back from the north of Iraq and had observed Ansar al-Islam guerrillas, the so-called al-Qaeda presence in Iraq, and would have testified that, in fact, they were not being trained by Saddam's government, that they were receiving no assistance, that, in fact, they were fighting Saddam's government and were operating from the U.S.-enforced safe haven of northern Iraq, or Iraqi Kurdistan. Rahm Emanuel, a hardliner on Israel, of course, as we've talked about on this program before, also one of the key people in the passage of NAFTA, and someone who's called for a dramatic expansion of the U.S. military. Madeleine Albright, one of the deans of the Democratic policy elite. Whether she gets a post or not in the Obama administration, many of her proteges are some of the key people operating now in the Obama team. Richard Holbrooke, who, of course, was one of the point people in the genocide in East Timor under the Carter administration, who also was one of the key figures in dismantling of Yugoslavia and also promoted the myth that Saddam had weapons of mass destruction, and in fact praised Colin Powell's fraudulent testimony before the United Nations, saying it was masterful diplomacy. These are some of the key people there, including Tony Lake. Juan, you know him well, the former national security advisor, deeply responsible for the destruction of Haiti.